So I'll be talking about actually dog and human factors that predict owner attachment to pet dogs. And there's quite a large team that will be acknowledged behind this, but primarily my postdoc advisor, Kristen Jacobson, James Serpel, and another postdoc, Pan Chen, contributed to this presentation. And so there's quite a bit of data suggesting that pet ownership improves health. And I think most of us are familiar with that, those sources that suggest that having a pet is beneficial to physical and psychological health. However, there's also quite a bit of data that doesn't get as much press, suggesting that pets may not actually improve psychological and physical health and may actually, in some cases, be detrimental to health. And for a comprehensive review of questioning whether pet ownership is beneficial to health, I definitely would encourage you, if you haven't already, to read Hal Herzog's review paper in Current Directions in the Psychological Sciences from 2011. And so what we've started thinking about in our research group is that it's likely the attachment to the companion animals that moderates whether individuals benefit or not from that relationship. And by attachment here, I mean the quality of the relationship between dogs and their owners. So pretty much the bond between the owner and their dog in this case. And there's research to suggest that there are different benefits associated with the relationship with a pet depending on your attitudes or attachment to the animal. For example, in Friedman's study, interaction with a dog lowered cardiovascular stress reactivity in individuals who had positive attitudes towards dogs. However, we saw the opposite response in individuals with negative attitudes towards dogs. They actually had a greater cardiovascular stress response. And so there has been some research looking at factors that contribute to the human-dog attachment bond. So starting with dog characteristics, a few studies, including James Serpel's research, shows that behavioral compatibility with owners' ideal expectations predicts how attached individuals are to their dogs. And similarly, in Budge's work, a high degree of compatibility between dog and owner predict the strength of the bond, which makes sense if you think about it. If you are a couch potato and your dog is running circles around you all day, you may not have the best of relationships. And then finally, scoring high on the Big Five inventory, that personality inventory that was mentioned yesterday in Sam Gosling's talk, scoring high on openness and agreeableness when in terms of the dogs being high on openness and agreeableness predicts owner attachment. And there's been quite a bit of research looking at human characteristics that predict owner attachment. A number of studies have looked at gender, and many have found that females tend to be more attached to their pets than males. However, there's really mixed data on this, and I don't think we can really draw conclusions about this yet. And part of the reason for this is that a lot of these studies have a lot more women in the study than men, and so there's really just not power to look at these differences. And then there's quite a bit of evidence that as individuals age, they tend to become more attached to pets. We see this particularly in pre-adolescence. So children become more attached to pets until about the age 12. And then in adolescence, lots of things are going on, and kids aren't necessarily having as strong of a relationship with their pet as they used to. And then in adults, we see that pet attachment tends to increase as individuals age. And there's not a lot of data looking at race and ethnicity and the relationship between this variable and attachment to pets. However, there is one study suggesting that in vet students, Caucasians report being more attached to their pets than the African American vet students. And so before I talk about these questions in the present study, I just want to reiterate that our research is really interested in for whom and what and under what conditions is pet ownership beneficial to individuals. And so what we're interested in looking at is, first of all, the dog behavioral characteristics, which ones predict owner attachment. And then we're interested in the owner characteristics. And then finally, we want to see whether owner characteristics moderate the relationship between dog behavioral characteristics and owner attachment. And so in this data set I'm talking about today, it includes 68 dog-owning families, and these families participated in a larger ongoing study that Kristen Jacobson is leading, looking at all kinds of factors that influence socio-emotional development in children. So the study also has information on the children's schools, their neighborhoods, their parents, their siblings, and also we have DNA to go back and look for any sort of relationship with genetics. And so we have in the sample 68 adults who were between 30 and 62 years of age. Most of these adults are the mothers of the child participants. And unfortunately, we have, again, a skew towards female adult participants, 87% being female, and half are Caucasian. And for the purposes of the study, we have race ethnicity classified as either Caucasian or non-Caucasian. And we have 105 children, and you'll notice this is from 68 families. So we have a number of sibling pairs represented in this sample. And the children are between 11 and 18 years of age. 57% are female, and about 55% are Caucasian. And so the dog behavioral characteristics we looked at were based on the Canine Behavioral Assessment and Research Questionnaire, which includes 14 subscales. And in this study, we're looking at 6 subscales, which include dog obedience and trainability, stranger-directed aggression and fear, separation-related problems, excitability, and attention-seeking behaviors. And for the owner characteristics, we looked at age and age class, and by age class, I mean whether these were children or adults. And we looked at gender, race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. And to look at socioeconomic status, we used the Hollingshead Index. And then we asked our participants a number of questionnaires, including the Dog Care Responsibility Inventory, which asked participants to report on what family members were most likely to provide the dog's care. For example, walk the dog, give the dog water, groom the dog. And we also asked them to complete the modified version of the pet attitude scale. So example questions from that are including some negatively scored questions. For example, I think the world would be a better place if people would stop caring so much for pets and start caring more for humans. And then other questions such as, I think pets should be considered members of the family. And then our outcome measure was based on the Sinclair Pet Attachment Scale. We're looking at attachment to dog using this measure. And so for the purposes of this study, we changed pet to dog in all of the questions. And an example question from this is, for example, when I'm feeling down, I seek out my dog for comfort, or I take pictures with me of my dog and show them to friends. And so I know there are a lot of numbers here, and so I have arrows pointing you to where I want you to look. And first of all, I want you to look at the diagonal. And here we have the CBARC subscales are the first 6 going down and the first 6 scales going across. And from the diagonal, we can see the relationship between parent and child reports. And this shows that there are strong correlations on 4 of the 6 CBARCs between child and parent reports. So children and parents tend to agree on how trainable their dog is, their dog's level of stranger aggression and stranger fear, their dog's levels of excitability. And then looking at the attitudes and responsibility indices, parents and children agree in terms of attitudes, not so much responsibility, which I can explain why that makes a lot of sense later. If you want to know. And then parents and children are highly correlated in their level of attachment to their dog. And then this arrow on the right here, the outcome measures the pet attachment scale. And these are the relationship between parents' reports of their relationship with their dog and their attachment to their dog. And we see that for parents, dog trainability predicts attachment, as does dog excitability and attention-seeking behavior, and their general attitudes towards pets predict their attachment to their dog, and their level of responsibility for the dog predicts their attachment. And then finally, this row here shows that for children, we don't see strong relationships between dog behavioral characteristics and attachment. However, we do see that for trainability, there is this positive relationship between the dog's level of trainability and the child's level of attachment. And then children's positive attitudes towards animals predict their level of attachment to their dog, as does their level of responsibility for their dog. Then at the very bottom here, which I'm sorry some of you in the back may not be able to see, I've just compared the means on the CBARC subscales and these other measures between the child reports and the parent reports. And actually what's interesting is that children tend to report a higher mean level of stranger fear and separation-related problems in their dogs than do their parents. And not surprisingly, parents report greater responsibility and care for the dog than do the children. And then I'm just being really obnoxious here with even more numbers, sorry. But what I want you to take from this is that we did multi-level modeling so that we took into account the fact that there were multiple individuals represented within the same family. And we did the stepwise modeling where first we looked to see if just human characteristics predicted the attachment to the dog. And so this is the first model, and none of these human characteristics like socioeconomic status, gender, age, race, ethnicity predicted attachment to the dog when analyzed alone. Then in model 2, we added in the 6 CBARC subscales of interest. And in this case, again, we see no relationship between the human characteristics and attachment, but we do see a positive relationship between dog obedience and owner attachment, which based on the correlational data is not a surprise. We wanted to make sure that we weren't capturing just individuals' fondness for pets or their responsibility for their dog. So in model 3, we added in the pet attitude measure and the responsibility measure, and we're still seeing here that even controlling for those, there's this relationship between dog obedience and owner attachment. And we also now have a positive relationship between separation-related problems and owner attachment. And then finally, the last model, there are a few steps between model 3 and model 4, or the final model, because we looked at interactions between the CBARC subscales and the owner characteristics. And this final model, this is what was left after we reduced the model down, and we see that we find the same relationships we had in model 3, but also there's an interaction going on between age class of the humans and the level of the dog's attention-seeking behavior and how that affects or predicts attachment to the dog. And then we have a race ethnicity by excitability interaction predicting attachment. So I'll break these interactions down in the next slide. And so this first slide here shows the relationship between the x-axis attention-seeking behavior and attachment to dog. And the blue line are adults, the orange line are children. And so for adults, the more attention-seeking behavior the dog shows, the more attached the adult reports being to the dog. However, for children, they just pretty much across the board, regardless of the dog's level of attention-seeking behavior, report relatively high attachment to the dog. And this was the second interaction. So we have the CBARC excitability measure on the x-axis and attachment to dog again on the y-axis. And the non-Caucasians are the orange line, Caucasians are the blue line. And we see that there's a trend approaching significance. So the slope is almost significant for Caucasians, showing that as dog excitability increases, their attachment to the dog is actually decreasing. And this slope for non-Caucasians is not significant. All right, and so just to sum up these findings here, we do see quite a bit of caregiver and child agreement. Although even though we see some correlations, for example, with stranger-related fear, children are rating their dogs higher on fear, which is quite interesting. But parents and children aren't correlating on separation problems and attention-seeking behavior. So it may be that parents and children are keying in on different behavioral characteristics in the dog. And for children and for across the human demographic characteristics we looked at, trainability predicted attachment to the dog, suggesting that perhaps there is this preference for well-behaved dogs. Interesting, the separation-related problems emerged as a predictor, which may be because people enjoy the company of dogs that have a high affinity for human social contact. I went through these interactions pretty well, and for the sake of time, I won't go back over that. And then, interestingly, we saw no gender differences, but that might be because we had so few male adults in this study. And so there are just a few limitations I wanted to point out. I don't want you to go home thinking that I'm saying dog behavior predicts attachment to the dog. That's a possibility, but we didn't explicitly test that. It may also be that attachment to the dog, that one's attachment to the dog influences the dog's behavior. So we have more research to do on that. And one thing that would help would be a longitudinal study looking at how the dog's behavior changes over time and the owner's attachment changes over time. And unfortunately, we didn't explore reasons for having a dog. There are always more questions that you want to ask that you just don't. And so again, more research for the future. But for example, that excitability interaction with race ethnicity, it would be interesting to see also if there's a difference, racial ethnic difference in whether the dog is housed outside or in the family, for example. And then finally, there's the question of generalizability. So our sample involved children between 10 and 18 or 11 and 18 years of age, and adults, primarily women, between 30 and 50 years of age. And so it'd be interesting to see if these results generalize to younger children, for example, adult males, the elderly, young adults, and individuals, adults without children. And so I guess the research kind of has spawned more questions than it answered, but I think that leaves us with more exciting research to do in the future. And then just wanted to acknowledge the individuals and sponsors of this research. Thank you.